Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody, pretend to hear me? Can everybody hear me from the microphone? No. Okay. It's not so important to hear me from the microphone because I know you can all hear me in the back of the room anyway. But let's do a sound check for the other microphones. Peter,
is this one working?
That's working. Niall.
Hello. Niall, officially.
Hi, everybody.
Excellent. Okay. So, as usual, not important so much to hear me, but now I can hear the echo that, in fact, you do hear me. My name is Hadar Harris, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law here at the law school. I am so very, very pleased to welcome all of you here today to this special event and very timely event. And I'm going to talk about why it is timely, why it is special, and who we have on the panel in just a moment. But as those of you who know me know, I would be remiss in not making a couple of announcements about upcoming events since we have you all captive here as you eat your pizza. So, this has been a big week for us, and it continues tomorrow with the first of a series of human rights coffee hours. This is something that is organized by our Student Advisory Board at the Center and is an opportunity for faculty, staff, alumni, because Peter just told me that he might come, and students to come together to talk about cutting-edge issues in the human rights world. Tomorrow we're going to be focused on the responsibility to protect and the case of Syria. My understanding is, I'm looking around, Elizabeth Abbey Murshed is coming, is that correct? Okay, so Elizabeth Abbey Murshed, who's done a great deal of work, she's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, will be there to throw out some preliminary ideas about the topic and to spark discussion. But it really is meant to be an opportunity for people interested in human rights to drink some coffee, eat some homemade baked goods, I understand, are coming. Oh no, I'm getting this look like don't throw that out there as an obligation. We'll see what comes tomorrow. I mean, an opportunity for a community building opportunity to talk about the issues. Next week, we have what really is one of the center points of our scope of activities for the student community for the fall. On Friday afternoon, we will be we are organizing a visit to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum downtown. We believe strongly that as a community here in Washington, D.C., we should be taking advantage of all of the amazing organizations and resources that are based here. And the Holocaust Museum is a very important place to go, and it is important to start our year of learning, talking, and activism together by a visit to that museum. We'll be going, meeting at 11:30 a.m. at the shuttle stop over there. I believe that's right. And heading down to the museum together on the Metro. It's free. You can come, and but you should send us an email to let us know that you're coming so that we know how many people will be there. We'll be meeting with a Holocaust survivor, which at this point is a dwindling opportunity as people are aging and dying, to hear their story, touring the permanent exhibit of the museum, and then meeting with a representative of the Committee on Conscience, which it works to prevent genocide from occurring around the world. So it's a great opportunity to come in. I would encourage any and all of you to join us if you can. And then on Saturday, on a rare Saturday event, the Center Student Advisory Board has also planned for the first time something that they are calling, I've not weighed in on the title, Human Rights Boot Camp. It provides you with what it is, a crash course for a day in human rights issues. Some of you joined us for Munching on Human Rights the other day to get a little taste of what human rights are. This will provide you an interactive forum to learn about human rights issues, to hear from alumni of the school working on human rights issues, and again, to build community with other students who are interested in the topic. So spaces are very limited. We encourage people to come both to the Holocaust Museum on Friday afternoon and boot camp, but that is not required. You could join us just for the Saturday piece of it, but we hope that many of you will join us there. Okay, I think those are my announcements that I have been I have been required to tell you as we start our conversation today. So, Northern Ireland, here you've got a map. I don't have to do the explanation, and I believe that Peter will do that. Is an area that sometimes you hear a lot about and sometimes you really don't hear a lot about in the news. And yet it's an area of the world that has had protracted and extremely violent political conflict for decades. In 1998, the Good Friday Accords were signed. There were a series of agreements which preceded and informed them over the 3 decades of violence known as the Troubles, which you'll hear about, which claimed over 3,500 lives and injured more than 40,000 people. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was a major step in a peace process, although the underlying causes of political strife and sectarian violence are not fully resolved, and we're going to hear a little bit about that. These accords were signed by the British and Irish governments and a wide group of political parties to try to end this more than 3 decades of protracted violence. During those 30 years, human rights violations were perpetrated by a variety of different actors on kind of all sides of the conflict. It was a very complicated and very violent existence. Armed groups, the state, and in many cases there was total impunity for these crimes. It's an impact which still has, it's an outcome which still has a broad impact on the population today. Many people point to the success of the Good Friday Agreements and to the peace and reconciliation process which has taken hold in that country, and yet there are still problems. Amnesty International, I was going to grab a copy of the report to wave around, Niall. You can wave it around. Just a few hours ago, this report entitled, thank you, Northern Ireland, Time to Deal with the Past. I have the embargoed copy because I want you to see how cool I am. And it's not in color because all of our color printers were broken. Northern Ireland, Time to Deal with the Past was released in Belfast. So today's discussion is extraordinarily timely in terms of wanting to bring attention to the fact of what needs to happen to really promote reconciliation within the country and to end impunity. The report, I believe that many people, well, at least now we'll talk about the report.
Yep.
And so I won't go into detail about it, although I had prepared such wonderful remarks around it. And so instead, we'll leave it to our distinguished speakers to really dig down on some of the issues that we're going to discuss today. We're very privileged to have 3 amazing speakers who will talk generally about the situation of Northern Ireland, the history of Northern Ireland, and the context of our discussion today. Peter Kissel, an alum of the school and the Human Rights Chair of the Irish American Unity Conference. He is currently the principal attorney at Kissel Law Office and really brought the idea of this event to the table as we had the opportunity to meet several months ago and talk about ways that we might be able to collaborate. And so I am grateful to him and to the work that he has done to raise attention to these issues. Niall Murphy is a solicitor and partner in Kevin R. Winters and Company, the largest criminal law practice on the island of Ireland. He has represented a variety of clients whose family members were victims of paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland and explored the collusion between security forces and paramilitary groups and has dug deeply into and represented family members from a variety of different perspectives whose rights have been violated over the course of the Troubles. And he brings great legitimacy to this conversation because he's got the accent. And so that's gonna add and contribute to it. Professor Diane Orentlicher, who even if she tried to have that accent would not be able to do that, is a professor of international law here at WCL. She is not just that, though. She has been working over many years in an attempt to combat impunity and to focus attention on fighting and prosecuting war crimes. She was formerly the UN Independent Expert on Combating Impunity, and as such, rewrote the guiding principles on combating impunity for the UN. She just recently returned to WCL after several years working as the deputy for war crimes issues in the U.S. Department of State. She has been described by the Washington Diplomat, and here, these are good notes. No, I love this one. I never introduce you this way. It's pretty awesome. As one of the world's leading authorities on human rights law and war crimes tribunals, and she is that. So we are very pleased to have the three of them here to paint the picture of what's going on today in Northern Ireland, where some of our challenges are for transitional justice and accountability, and to talk about this report having just been released a few hours ago that Amnesty International has put out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter Kissel, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, Hedar. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, good. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to first thank Hedar again for putting this program together. She gave me far too much credit for it. The thanks really go to you and the Center for doing this, Hedar. And, of course, I'm also appreciative of Washington College of Law doing this, and I'm proud of the WCL for doing it. As Hedar mentioned, I'm a graduate of the school here, not here, actually, in another facility. In 1972, as a matter of fact, which was an interesting time to be in law school in Washington. And I also want to thank the students in particular for being here. I'm very excited to see so many law students expressing an interest in this. And one other thing, I'm honored to be on this panel with Niall, whom I've worked with previously on a couple of matters, and also with Diane, who I've not met before, so I'm very honored to be with both of you as well. Briefly, I should give just a little bit of my own background in terms of where I come from and interest in human rights in Northern Ireland. I was actually born into what would, believe it or not, be called a mixed marriage in Northern Ireland. That is, my father was a German Protestant, and my mother was Irish Catholic, and she came from a big Irish Catholic family many generations down. They were not political, but they were very ever-present. My parents never quarreled over religion, and I am the beneficiary of seeing, I think, the best of both religions, two of the many major religions in the world, of course. I appreciated the best part of Protestantism through my dad, and I appreciated the best part of Roman Catholicism through my mother. I also came to understand the many and serious faults of both sides of that equation. But at any rate, so I don't come at this issue with any particular religious animosity or agenda. I come at it rather from a human rights standpoint. My interest in it was really galvanized on my first trip to Northern Ireland with my wife Sharon in the summer of 1994, and we were absolutely appalled and shocked to have to go through a bristling military checkpoint just to get into Northern Ireland, and then on top of that to be subjected constantly to random roadblocks, security checks with assault weapons thrust in our faces, demanding to know who we are, where we're going, where we're coming from, what our agenda is, by British Army officers. And that kind of shocked us into a reality of just how serious and frankly intolerable the situation in the north of Ireland was. And it's come a long way from there. I've been to Belfast a number of times. I've toured some of the scenes of the violence, and I have spoken quite at length with people on both sides of the Protestant, Catholic, or Unionist, Nationalist divide. And the people there are really quite wonderful people, and for the most part really do want to keep moving forward. I'm going to examine three cases real quickly of particular atrocities committed by either the British Army or agents of the British government. And I'm going to concentrate on them because they are really the type of case that is a particular sticking point for moving further forward in Northern Ireland right now. The first one is the Ballymurphy Massacre, in which 11 unarmed civilians were shot dead by the British Army Parachute Regiment in 1971. The second one is the brutal murder of civil rights attorney Patrick Finucane in 1989, and the third one is the equally brutal murder of another top civil rights lawyer, Rosemary Nelson, in 1999. None of these murders have been solved, and we will examine the efforts that have been made to do that. As I'm going through this, I'd like all of us to keep in mind several concepts which are important in thinking about accountability and transitional justice. The first two are related. They are truth and justice, and I say truth as distinguished from justice because, as I will address again at the end of my remarks, achieving truth is a necessary and achievable goal in a post-conflict situation. Achieving real justice is very elusive and may be unrealistic in a lot of situations. Another concept, credibility. Credibility in particular of the police force. It is crucial and it is very hard to achieve. A third concept would be confidence, and I mean confidence in the political system, which goes hand in hand with credibility in the police system. And finally, think about momentum and transparency. It is very important to keep the momentum of a post-conflict peace process moving forward. We've seen some stagnation in Northern Ireland over the past year or two, and it is very troubling and it is very scary because areas that have had difficult situations can slide back easily if the peace process does not keep moving forward, encouraged by the governments as well as the people involved. So the three cases in Northern Ireland I'm talking about all involved the murder of civilians who were unarmed. There were some different fact patterns in each of them, but there are some similarities in the strategies to achieve at least truth, if not justice, in those situations. And again, the Northern Ireland slide that is up there, you might just take a look at the border of Northern Ireland as by way of background. That border is one of the most gerrymandered in the world. It would put a Massachusetts politician to shame. And it's, of course, not coincidental. It was done in 1922 to make sure that Northern Ireland had a majority Unionist Protestant population. It divided the province of Ulster in half. And so when people talk of Ulster, it's really broader than Northern Ireland, but the British government divided it in half in order to keep a majority there for voting purposes. If you could flip to the second slide, Andrea. And just to give a further view, there's the island of Ireland with Northern Ireland as part of it. There's been a lot of progress there in the last 15 years since the Good Friday Agreement, but they're still two separate and distinct entities, and that causes problems. The first case I'll mention is the Ballymurphy massacre. In August of 1971, the British government imposed internment on Ballymurphy. Ballymurphy is a working-class Catholic section of West Belfast. Internment was proposed to try to, or rather imposed, to try to suppress the area and keep it under very, very tight military control. Unfortunately, the British Army Regiment, for whatever reason, wound up murdering 11 civilians, unarmed civilians, over 3 days. And I'll just give a sketch, a couple of those to give you an idea. Joan Connolly was a mother of 8. She was out with her young children, 10 and 11 years old, I believe. She got separated from them as the British military presence was moving through the neighborhood. And she wound up being shot 3 times in the face. She was blinded. She was on the ground and bleeding. And nobody could get to her, and she bled to death. One of her children is currently involved in the Ballymurphy family campaign. Danny Teggart was a father of 13 people. He was out trying to assist his grown children, make sure they were safe, and he was walking back home across a field when he was shot, and after he fell down, the Army soldiers came over and filled him with 14 bullets. The third case was a priest, Father Hugh Mullen, who was going to the assistance of a young man who had been shot, and Father Mullen, for his deed, was shot dead at the scene. Father Mullen at least achieved something, and that is that the fellow he was helping did live. If you could flip to the next screen, Andrea. Oops, wrong one. Yes. The random nature of these murders in the neighborhood can be seen. Numbers 1 and 2 were two people who were killed early on the morning of August the 9th. At about the same time, numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6 were murdered in a little bit different section of that neighborhood. So you had different army soldiers roving around the neighborhood, indiscriminately killing people. Number 7 was killed on the next day, Eddie Doherty, and then on the 11th, 4 more people were killed. And as you can see with the purple dots, they were all killed in different sections. So it wasn't a matter of the Army being frightened by some kind of a mass demonstration of the people. Rather, they literally walked around the neighborhood and started shooting people. And on top of that, they then humiliated the daughters and children of some of the people who had been murdered. Alice Harper, another daughter of one of the victims, tried to find out where her father was being held, not knowing he was dead. And she was treated in the Army barracks to a chorus by British soldiers of "Where's Your Papa Gone?" which is a familiar song at the time. So I just wanted to paint that to get an idea of some of the wounds and some of the difficulties and the pain that was imposed upon at least that area of Valley Murphy. The Valley Murphy campaign started in 1998 in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, and it was kind of ad hoc. Some of the family members started trading stories, and they then formed I wouldn't even call it a committee, a loose organization of concerned children of these people who were murdered almost 40 years earlier. And they have made many, many efforts over the last 15 years and made a lot of great strides. They brought their campaign to the U.S., by the way, in 2010. And in 2011, they secured a hearing before the Helsinki Commission, the Congressional Helsinki Commission, chaired by Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey. And that helped move the ball forward. Subsequently, they have met with various authorities of the British government as well as the Irish government. They have held different events. They have held fundraisers, of course, but they have also sponsored exhibitions and films. I have on the table a list of various human rights organizations and reconciliation organizations of Northern Ireland. And you are welcome to pick that up. There are websites included there, including the Valley Murphy campaign website. So they have been fighting for a long time to get an independent inquiry into what just happened. They are not seeking compensation. They are not seeking revenge. They are not even seeking trials. What they are seeking is an independent panel that can declare what really happened in Valley Murphy, because the British government has consistently stonewalled any real inquiry into that situation. The Good Friday Agreement formed a police branch, I should say, in Northern Ireland called the Historical Enquiries Team. The HET was to look into, to investigate all of the atrocities on all sides of the past. Unfortunately, it was immediately restaffed by a number of retired, forced into retirement, former police officials, and things got so bad that just 2 months ago, on July 3 of this year, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Constabulary, which is the equivalent of the British government's Inspector General of the Police of Northern Ireland, issued an absolutely damning report of the HET, including how they have not paid attention to a number of crimes, they have been secretive, and it is particularly appropriate that the title, the first name of the title of this event today is accountability, because accountability was one of the things addressed in the HET report. They said that we believe, in our section entitled 4.2 Accountability, they said we believe a lack of scrutiny has been an important contributing factor to many of the imperfections in the HET process. The Valley Murphy campaign continues. They met 2 days ago with members of Parliament and presented their case for an independent panel to Parliament. So we hope that that keeps moving forward. If we could, Andrea, if we could go to slide number 6. I'll talk briefly, because Hadar is pushing me to finish up, about the Patrick Finucane murder. Patrick Finucane was a leading civil rights lawyer in Northern Ireland. He represented people on both sides of the divide, Irish, rather Catholic nationalists, as well as Protestant Unionists. He sat down to Sunday dinner in February of 1989 with his wife Geraldine and 3 children, and 2 masked gunmen bashed in his front door with a sledgehammer, walked in, and shot him 14 times in front of his family. The murder has never been solved. There have been a number of starts and stops of trying to investigate the murder. The British government had agreed, as part of one of the agreements emanating from Good Friday, that they would conduct a public independent inquiry to find out what really happened and who was responsible. In 2011, the British Prime Minister Cameron informed the family that no, they weren't going to conduct any inquiry, thank you very much. In 2012, the British government at least did issue a formal apology in Parliament. So, and there have been hearings before the Helsinki Commission and also the Subcommittee on Global Human Rights to push for a true investigation into Patrick Finucane's murder. It has not happened, but the effort has not ceased. So we're hopeful that that will be achieved. But at least in that case, the family did receive a formal apology, unlike the Valley Murphy families. The third one is the Rosemary Nelson murder. Rosemary Nelson, after Patrick Finucane's murder, rose to become one of the top leading civil rights lawyers in Ireland. In March of 1999, she walked out to her car one morning, turned it on, and a bomb underneath it blew up, and she died 2 hours later in the hospital. There has not been an inquiry into her. The British government did appoint an independent judge to at least take a look at it, and Judge Peter Corey in 2003 made his findings, including the statement, there is evidence of collusion by government agencies in the Nelson murder that warrants holding a public hearing, and further that a campaign of death threats and vile abuse, some of it sexual in character, by the police officers of Northern Ireland were directed against Mrs. Nelson. The police, in other words, knew she was going to be murdered. They helped target her, and that is what resulted in her death. And as a lawyer in this area, it gives me chills to think about a state or state agents carrying out the murder of civil rights lawyers and then never following up to find out the truth of what happened. If I may wrap up real quickly, I mentioned in the beginning truth and justice. What I conclude from having worked in Northern Ireland and with Northern Ireland is that while true justice in the form of bringing people who are responsible to account for it, including criminal prosecutions, justice for misdeeds during a conflict period is very difficult to achieve. The government will stonewall it. The entrenched military security apparatus will do everything to prevent it. They will lie. They will renege on promises. And so achieving that is frankly unrealistic in a lot of cases. But achieving truth is essential, and it should be demanded, and it is definitely a realistic goal which families should seek. And until the truth is fleshed out on crimes like these, moving forward in a post-conflict society, the elements of justice as well as the other structures of society is virtually impossible, because people will not have the confidence in the political system or have faith in the criminal justice system. So I'll stop there so that we can move on.
Thank you, Peter. It should be noted that, I had all these prepared remarks, but we were running so late, that in addition to the cases that Peter lays out just this morning, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Theresa Villiers, declared that there would not be an independent commission of inquiry on the Omagh bombing, which was a bombing that was one of the most, I think, damaging or significant in one fell swoop bombing that took place, 29 people killed, I think around 400 people injured, saying that this was not an easy decision to make. All views were carefully considered, but I believe that the ongoing investigation by the Office of the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland is the best way to address any outstanding issues relating to the police investigation. It's important to note that this lack of investigation, this lack of documentation, and this lack of truth-finding is something that is coming on all sides, and not only in terms of violations or atrocities that may have been committed both by the British but also by the IRA and other organs. It's across the board. The HET that Peter mentioned is one of a multiplicity of organs that either have been undermined, have been politicized, or have just been ineffective in their work, and that's something well articulated, I believe, by the Amnesty International report. So on that note, I'm going to hand it to Niall to talk a little bit more about that and the overall mechanisms that exist, which may not be fulfilling their real mandate. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank Peter and the University for inviting me to speak here this lunchtime. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's a regret that I would not be invited to speak at my own university, Queen's University in Belfast, because the work that our practice undertakes is one which exposes an inconvenient truth. And a lot of those inconvenient truths have been recorded and reported upon in today's Amnesty report. The university that I went to would have been a predominantly state-inspired university, not one where free thinking and independent thought would have been promoted amongst the students. And that I am invited to speak at a university 3,000 miles from home is a matter of great pride to me and to my practice. That said, there are certain issues that do require to be ventilated to as public an audience as possible, and to that end I seek to take this opportunity to let you know as to the human rights abuses which are currently being perpetrated in the UK. For constitutional reasons, I hold an Irish passport. I can't vote in an Irish election. A person from the 6 counties that occupy the northern part of the map that was on the screen earlier can be the Irish president, but her brother or sister cannot vote in that same election for them. Therefore, in a state context, the United Kingdom holds the responsibilities for ensuring that international human rights norms are adhered to in the 6 counties that make up the northern jurisdiction. And to that end, it's regretful that I am here to relate to you how pathetic a record the UK has for according itself to international human rights norms. I had prepared some remarks, and I'm not going to speak to them verbatim, but I do have them in preparation here. But I do want to commence with a quote that I certainly think sets the tone, and I think is mentioned in the Amnesty report. Impunity is caused or facilitated notably by the lack of diligent reaction of institutions or state agents to serious human rights violations. States are to combat impunity as a matter of justice for the victims, as a deterrent with respect to future human rights violations, and in order to uphold the rule of law and public trust in the justice system. Now that's a quote from the 2011 guidelines from the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe on eradicating impunity for serious human rights abuses, cited in a European case in 2012 pertaining to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. However, the principles that are espoused in that quote could be directly applicable to the situation at home in the north of Ireland. the context of what happened in the conflict has been articulated by Peter, and I don't seek to rehash that. It was a very accurate and insightful synopsis. However, if I could perhaps bring a legal perspective to it, and that will then inform you to make your own evaluation, and I would encourage everybody to read the Amnesty report as to the current situation which pertains, because the UK is a Category 1 signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I heard at the commencement of the remarks that you were all implored to attend the Holocaust Museum next week. Actually, I had a few hours spare this morning, and that's where I went myself, and it is a most sobering experience. But the European Convention of Human Rights is born from the experience of the Holocaust. The Western society's undertaking to the rest of Europe, and indeed as an inspiration to the rest of the world, that the horrors of the Holocaust can never be allowed to happen again, and as such the European Convention of Human Rights was born out of that, to accord to all citizens of Europe fundamental human rights, the most principal of which is Article 2 of the European Convention, and that will be a legal theme that I'm going to develop. Article 2 is the most fundamental right that any citizen in any European country has a naturally born right to, and the UK as a state has an international obligation. It's not an opt-in, it's not a soft law. They are obliged to uphold Article 2, and they don't. And I will be able to set that out as to why that is. The history of the conflict at home, from a state context, has various nefarious methods. There were direct British Army killings of individuals, most prominently in the early 1970s, when there was a lawlessness and anarchy which prevailed. I wasn't born, thankfully. I was born in 1976. But there was an anarchy and a complete abandonment of social norms, which led to the likes of Ballymurphy, which led to Bloody Sunday, which happened in Derry, and incidental multi-murders in between. And not one British Army soldier has ever been prosecuted for the murders that were committed in the 1970s. That, in my view, is impunity in action. Moving on from the reckless, proactive, in-soldier uniform murders that were committed in the 70s, the 1980s, the fact that myself, as an Irishman and as a person interested in upholding human rights is here in America is not a novel concept. Irish people have been coming to America for decades, imploring and drawing upon the Irish diaspora, which is very strong and vibrant in the United States, to understand the conflict and what goes on at home, because there is a diplomatic power that resides in this city that does have courage and weight and influence on the UK state. For example, the McBride principles, which were enshrined, enforced fair employment. Where I'm from, my parents were themselves teachers, but could never have got a job in any of the industries, because they were jobs that were wholly secured for the unionist tradition. And I'm not the type of person that would seek to promote the religious narrative in the conflict. It was a-religious. The Republican dimension were not fighting on theological grounds for Catholicism, and equally loyalism was more interested in loyalty to the British Crown than it was to any issues which led to the Reformation. It was a-religious, but was political in its source, and to that end the British state was not an independent arbiter or a referee, which is how she likes to hold herself. And as recently as this week, Theresa Villiers has said, with regards to ongoing talks that are coming up, that the British government will do everything in their power to assist the parties. They should be in the room as a party, because they were an actor to the conflict through their murders that were committed. So moving on from the 1970s and the direct British Army killings, there was a more nuanced approach to quelling the revolutionary intent which was present in Ireland, and it became a police-led operation by virtue of the old RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Now, as an aside, an anecdote, The RUC was the only police constabulary in the entire UK jurisdiction that adhered the term royal to its constabulary. Not one English police constabulary was called the Royal Norfolk Constabulary, the Royal Manchester Constabulary. The only royal police constabulary in the UK was in Ulster, 2/3 of it in any event. And the RUC then took over the mantle of suppression of the nationalist people through a series of murders that were to attract severe international inquiry on a programme called the Shoot to Kill murders in 1982. I happen to represent some of the families to this day. 6 unarmed individuals in the North Armagh area were in 3 separate incidents stopped and murdered by the RUC, by the police, not the army, by the police. And such was the international opprobrium led by human rights activists, lawyers. Pat Finucane represented the families, and I'm very proud to continue his motto, and religious personnel, all of which came to Washington, and all of which called upon American influence to ensure that there was an impartial investigation into these RUC murders. And there was an assistant chief constable, a very senior police officer from Manchester called John Stalker, was appointed to investigate the murders, and did. He investigated them properly, and he recommended prosecutions for the RUC officers who committed the murders. They were acquitted, unfortunately, by a jaundiced court, in my view, but that did not stop the RUC blackening John Stalker's name. And John Stalker was himself subjected to intimidation through the security services, retired from the police, never worked as a police officer again. But such was the requirement for truth and justice mechanisms in that case, that the only system that was open to the families to engage with was an inquest. And as you will all know, that the inquest system is the most rudimentary and perfunctory of legal processes in any sudden death. And the inquest coronial court system became the battleground, and the only avenue open for truth recovery and fact recovery. The chief coroner in Belfast abandoned the inquests into those murders in 1994 on the basis that he could not hold a proper inquest because he was denied the right to read Stalker's report. Now, after 30 years, last year, I received Stalker's report. It's under severe embargo. I can't comment to it. Needless to say, as a result of it, civil proceedings have been initiated against the Chief Constable for wrongful killing. But in terms of how the state was able to act with impunity, it had every opportunity to commit these atrocities and walk away, because the state, the UK, was the referee, they were the police, they were the court. It was their football, and they made up the rules. They changed the goalposts, and that goes on to this day, and that is what the amnesty report is all about. Now, the package of measures that arises from 5 test cases which were taken to the European Court of Human Rights and resulted in judgments in 2001. And these human rights cases led to what practitioners refer to as a big bang. It changed the game forever with regards to how truth recovery could be viewed in the Irish context. It imposed, one of the cases was Massacre, another case was Finucane, and these were cases whereby the UK state was indicted for breaching Article 2, breaching the right to life, failing to have a process by which its own sins could be examined. And the UK, who likes to hold itself out as one of the world's policemen, was now indicted as a human rights abuser by the European Court of Human Rights, in breach of the convention that was born from the experience of the Holocaust. And those breaches led to the state having to propose a package of measures to deal with this ongoing condemnation. The 3 package of measures were the historical inquiries team that Peter has referred to, a police ombudsman, that was part of the Good Friday Agreement negotiations, that the RUC would be disbanded, which it was. A PSNI was incepted, but for the nationalist people to have a confidence in the PSNI, there required to be an ombudsman to ensure accountability and to supervise any criminality which may go on, and to also retrospectively look at the criminality of the old RUC for shoot-to-kill policies, for example, and also the inquest system. None of them worked. None of them worked. And this report examines in great detail, page 37, Bala Murphy, page 41 to 42, Pat Finucane. For example, the HET, as Peter has touched upon, the HMIC had a report. The HET had an abjectly different approach to cases which involved the British Army. For example, one of the HET's policies was that the HET treated deaths where there was state involvement differently from those where there was not. From its operational guide, it said it was not appropriate to compare state-involved cases with non-state-involved cases. And this is a direct quote. The HET maintains it is not appropriate to compare the review processes in military cases with murders committed by terrorists. That is to presuppose that killings committed by the British Army was not murder, and therefore there was not the requirement to investigate it the way they investigated paramilitary cases. Similarly, with the police ombudsman, it was infected by a cancer from within. There was an institution set up within it, a sensitive institution, and that was staffed wholly and exclusively by British security services. There was 3 reports in June 2011 by the Criminal Justice Inspector, by the Committee on the Administration of Justice, and by the Department of Justice, all of whom found that there had been a lowering of independence and the operational capability of the Police Ombudsman's Office to investigate crimes. So its historic directorate, which was itself a response to the to the 2001 Article 2 cases, was abandoned. The HET presently is not allowed to investigate British Army cases as a result of the July HMIC report, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. But the most offensive of the package of measures, in my respectful opinion, is the inquest system. The most perfunctory of legal processes. There are now presently, and I updated my numbers, there are now 38 Article 2 inquests touching upon 65 deaths involving 18 referrals from the Attorney General with 2 coroners. There has been 2 completed inquests and there are 38 still to be held. How long is that going to take? The policy at all times is to permit delay, and delay in itself leads to impunity. Delay is impunity, and that was a case that was found to be the case in a European court action which was resulted in July, just past, of Grew and McCahey. And I would like to just briefly quote, and I appreciate the pressure of time, a Bulgarian judge, Judge Kaladayeva. She found the period of demonstrated, if not deliberate, systemic refusals and failures make it possible for at least some agents of the state to benefit from virtual impunity as a result of the passage of time. Also within the Legacy Disclosure Unit, the PSNI had a Legacy Disclosure Unit that would service the coroner system. Now, the coroner system is staffed by professional coroners and solicitors working for the coroner. The PSNI retained the material. For example, the PSNI retained Stalker's report. The coroner was obsequiously presented with a Legacy Disclosure Unit to deal with the PSNI's disclosure to the inquest system. 6 of the 8 officers in the Legacy Disclosure Unit were former RUC officers. 5 of them were special branch. That's security intelligence. One of whom served with 52 witnesses to the Stalker Sampson murders. Not knew of, served with. So the person that was providing the disclosure to the coroner was the war criminal, in my respectful view. So how can our state move forward in a transitional justice period with all of the package of measures having been proven to fail, and all of which are it's not just me saying it, I do represent people. Amnesty International now saying it, and Amnesty International today in Belfast have called for a single mechanism to provide an independent, impartial, Article 2 compliant for all the sins of the past by all state actors to be attended to. Teresa Villers, I don't think it's a coincidence whatsoever that she chose today to say there will be no public inquiry in the OMA. The state has no interest in meeting its own Article 2 obligations, and I regret to say it is a very dark and difficult time for those seeking to protect and uphold human rights at home at present. And I appreciate it probably overrun, and I'd like to pass you on to the Professor.
Thank you, Nat.
I was trying to whisper to Nal to take my time because this is so important and interesting. As I mentioned to Hadar when she invited me to be on this panel, I'm not an expert in this area, and my work has been more global in focus. And so I asked to play a minimal role because I think that what these two gentlemen have to say is really so much more important than what I can say. Let me sort of briefly then try to put this in a wider context of the UN's approach on impunity, and then if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you some questions. I know that's Hadar's job, but I'd be interested in relating some of the work you're doing to the work of the UN principles. So I know that the UN principles on combating impunity are not a household name, and I suspect Juan Mendes is probably the only one in the room who's ever heard of them. The UN principles that were initially drafted by a French judge, Louis Joinet, and were submitted to the then UN Subcommission on Human Rights in 1997. Several years later, the UN High Commissioner's Office wanted to sort of push those principles to a higher level of recognition within the UN system, and the UN Commission, which preceded the current Human Rights Council, appointed me, actually the Secretary General appointed me to take up the task of sort of bringing Joinet's principles into the contemporary era. The basic framework that Joinet developed are very much reflected in the principles that as I updated them and as they were endorsed by the Human Rights Commission. And so there are just a couple of basic concepts I want to mention. One is that the principles reflect international standards as they had developed at the time I drafted them, and as were reflected in the case law of international courts and tribunals. Some of the jurisprudence of the European Court that Niall mentioned informed their development. So they reflect a framework of international law and try to capture those and codify those. But at the same time, one of the approaches that I took in updating the principles was to try to also create a bigger space for societies to have a significant voice in the way they addressed human rights violations, the legacy of human rights violations in their own country. And as you might imagine, that those two approaches can in some ways be in tension because international standards, when they really are legal standards that are binding, often don't leave a lot of play for local options. Certain types of offenses must be seriously investigated, as Niall has been indicating. The jurisprudence of the European Court has indicated that the serious investigation has to be credible and capable of identifying those responsible with a view toward leading to their punishment. So these are serious international standards. There's not a lot of give in the joints as to what's required. On the other hand, it was important to me to not have the principles have a voice of the all-knowing UN or independent expert that says, and y'all have to have a truth commission. It has to look just like this. And so part of what the principles reflect as well are the experiences of various societies, the choices they've made within the framework of international law with a view to making it possible for societies to have input based on the experience of other countries. So that's the sort of basic approach. There are three components of the principles for combating impunity, or 4 or 5 depending on how you count them. So one is the right to justice, and as I just suggested, that particular right is one that doesn't have, that in some ways reflects a mandate, particularly on the part of states that are parties to human rights and treaties like the European Court of Human Rights. These serious offenses have to be subject to a serious investigation, et cetera, et cetera. A second component, and one that I think was particularly important to Louis Joinet, was the right to truth or the right to know. And as that concept, which has continued to develop since the principles were endorsed by the Human Rights Commission, that concept has two components. One is the sort of collective right to know, and I'm going to read this because I think it's just one sentence. Every people has the inalienable right to know the truth about past events concerning the perpetration of heinous crimes and about the circumstances that led through massive or systematic violations to the perpetration of those crimes. Full and effective exercise of the right to truth provides a vital safeguard against the recurrence of violations. Okay, that was two sentences. I was struck that this amnesty report does a really excellent job of explicating the significance of this kind of society-wide exploration of what happened in the past as a way not only to answer the needs of victims, but also to provide a firm, truthful foundation for a society to prevent future violations. The second component is the individual right to truth. And again, the amnesty report and the work that Peter and Niall have done is so relevant to the individual right to know. And this is a right of victims and their families, imprescriptible right to know the truth about the circumstances in which violations took place, and in the event of death or disappearance, the victim's fate. And as Peter was talking earlier about how important it was to family members to know what happened to my loved one at that moment. I've heard this in so many countries, in so many different contexts, and I think it's just a profound universal need that it's very hard to fathom if you haven't experienced this kind of tragedy yourself. Reparations for victims is and I'm using that as a shorthand for various forms of repair for victims, is another key component of the principles. This has been elaborated in greater detail in another human rights instrument guiding principles on reparations. And finally, guarantees of reform and measures to prevent a recurrence of violence. And this category is sort of forward-looking, although based on full understanding of what happened in the past, what kind of structures made it possible for serious violations to take place on a massive scale. And as the amnesty report and as Niall was talking about both make clear, partially stemming out of the Good Friday Agreement and partly as a result of these initiatives that Niall talked about, there have been significant steps taken that would come under the broad rubric of guarantees of non-recurrence. There have been institutional reforms within the police, and as Niall devastatingly reminds us, a lot of these guarantees of institutional reform haven't worked very well. Sort of with that background, I'd love to sort of turn back to you a couple of questions, if I may.
Please.
One of the issues that I highlighted and other people who hold mandates now in the UN human rights system would almost invariably highlight is the importance of bringing to the surface crimes of sexual violence, which when I was coming of age as a human rights lawyer just didn't get attention. And when I look back on human rights reports that I was involved in when I was a lot younger than I am today, it's striking to me that those reports had very little to say about sexual violence, even in contexts that we later realized where that was a serious. So I was curious, I was flipping through this report this morning, didn't fully absorb it, but I didn't see any discussion of that. You mentioned earlier, Peter, Rosemary Nelson being subjected to sexual abuse. So I'd be curious to hear how that phenomenon figures in the legacy and ongoing violations, and to what extent that figures in the work you're doing. One comment I wanted to make, and I meant to mention earlier, the justice component of the UN principles on combating impunity recognizes the important role of civil parties in making justice happen. Part of the focus, to the extent that was mentioned in the principles, was on legal systems that provide civil parties a formal role in initiating and conducting prosecutions. But in general, in a lot of contexts where there have been serious obstacles to the state following through on its responsibilities to ensure justice, private parties have played an indispensable role in enforcing greater responsiveness by the state. And against that background, as I've listened to your work, you're playing an indispensable role. So that's a comment, not a question. So the last question that is somewhat related to that, we were talking a bit before the panel about my limited experience, and I have no idea how representative this is. But in some of my past work on the principles and on an earlier study I did for the UN, looking at best practices on impunity, other conferences that I participated in at the UN's invitation, a spectrum of views were represented, and often Irish participants in those discussions were on the end of the spectrum that was pushing for the UN to sort of ease up on insisting on criminal process with respect to serious human rights violations. And there are a number of initiatives that I continue to be asked to at least provide input on where that perspective is still reflected. And again, I don't know if that's representative, but it's been my experience, and I don't know, and so sort of going back to my point earlier about the views of civil society, the importance of their input, I would love to hear you comment a bit about how you see the broader social debate about the best way to proceed with reckoning with the past. I hope that wasn't too vague a question, but...
No, and I'll do my best. With regard to the broader social debate and the broader mandate as to how a post-conflict truth recovery mechanism would look, that was exceptionally well investigated and resourced by a panel led by Lord Robin Eames and retired priest Father Dennis Bradley. Lord Eames is he was a leader of the Presbyterian Church, would have been perceived to have been a unionist, an exceptional advocate for peace, and Dennis Bradley, a retired Catholic priest, therefore was perceived to represent the nationalist interest, was the first chairperson of the policing board before nationalist political parties endorsed the policing board. So he would have been perceived to have been an important influence in the post-conflict criminal justice mechanisms. And Eames Bradley prepared, in my view, the most detailed research and review as to how the entire spectrum of society viewed on what they wanted from a process. The consultation period lasted 2 years. It engaged all strata of society. It engaged victims of state violence. It engaged victims of Republican violence. It engaged victims of loyalist violence. It engaged those injured by the conflict, dealing with their injuries. It engaged social organs like the churches, sporting movements such as the GAA. Jarlath Burns was represented. I'm sure that the Eamon will appreciate Jarlath Burns' involvement. And that report produced the exact same conclusion as what Amnesty produced today, that there be a single mechanism, that the HET, for the reasons that were being pronounced as far back as 2005, in 2009 there was a university academic, Patricia Lundy, drafted the first report saying that the HET wasn't fit for purpose, that 66% of its staff was former RUC and were investigating their own colleagues. And Eames Bradley recommended that the historic directorate of the Police Ombudsman, the work that had been commenced and was being conducted by the HET and the inquest system, be subsumed into a legacy commission, and that it be resourced by all the funds being disgorged by the 3 package of measures, and that there be one single entity with independence and with power to investigate all extant truth recovery issues, and that people can present. And if people want prosecutions, well, then people should be, where the evidence permitted, should be permitted the opportunity to seek prosecutions. Where people wanted to know the truth, I was reading in the Amnesty report, and you know, trauma is a very complex thing. One family, for example, just wanted to know did their loved one receive the last rites before they passed away, and that they were able to told that they were able to gather that information was all that they wanted out of the process. And it was envisaged by Ames Bradley that there be a one-stop shop to receive all. That was horrifying for the state, for the UK, because that mechanism would have got to the core of state abuses, because the British state keep records. We've seen it in Kenya in the 1950s. They recently settled a massive civil case taken by the Mau Mau tribes for internment. 5,500 litigants all received settlements on a class action, and there are other actions coming from Britain's colonial past. So the state had the records, the state had the problems to face, and the state crashed Ames Bradley, not on the Legacy Commission, which was its main message, but there was a reparation, I'm sure you'll appreciate, as a mechanism for post-conflict societies, and there was a recognition payment that was called of £12,000 for each victim of the conflict, and that was spun by the NIO, by the Northern Ireland Office, the sort of securocrat intelligence agenda, that they knew that would be inflammatic to the unionist population, that an IRA volunteer who had been killed on active service, possibly carrying a weapon, that his family would get the same recognition payment as a baby killed in an IRA bomb. That was considered to be inappropriate. However, as is the statutory interpretation of what a victim is, it's not the person who has died, it's the family that they leave behind. So the mother of the bombing pain is the same as the mother's pain from the IRA volunteer killed in active service, and it was a recognition payment for all of those people. And the NIO spun it on the morning of the report that this was not acceptable, and Ames Bradley, after 2 years and the most traumatic consultation process, was crashed. And here we have, 6 years later, Amnesty coming out with the exact same conclusion, effectively. However, Amnesty had the wisdom not to go for reparation payments, albeit I think that is something that should happen, and solely restricted their opinions to mechanisms to replace a package of measures which are demonstrably failed. So the question that they asked, the process has already been done and has already been crashed for political expediency to again perpetrate impunity for state actions.
Diane, another question you posed was asked for comments on what about crimes of a sexual nature. For whatever reason, I am not aware of allegations of British troops or the police committing sexual assaults against the women of Northern Ireland. Now, I'm sure I imagine there have been some instances of it, but it's not primarily a problem. Now, why that is, I've got my own speculation as to some of the reasons that may be. Historically, the British people have viewed Irish people as subhuman. I mean, there was a whole mentality of that throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And for whatever reason, some of that may be carrying forward. But the Rosemary Nelson case is, I believe there was a sexual undertone to that. As the Corey report, Judge Corey's report stated, there were threats of a sexual nature made against her, I also don't believe that it was coincidental that the method of her death was completely different from the method of Patrick Finucane's death. He was, to use a crude term, he was shot like a man. They planted a bomb under Rosemary Nelson's driver's seat, which ensured that if she weren't killed, she would not have been identifiable as a woman. And I don't think that was coincidental. That's my own belief. But generally, there have not been allegations of sexual abuse by the forces of security against the Irish people, as far as I'm aware of. Now, Niall may have a different take on that.
No, it's not a phenomenon that existed.
Or at least was documented. I'm conscious of our time, and we really only have a couple of minutes because I hear people massing outside for a class that may be coming in. Maybe we have time for one question, and I apologize that we didn't get to questions from the audience. But if anybody has a pressing question, comment? Yes, please.
So I'd be very interested to hear what you think the United States could do better to support this.
Well, at the minute, every initiative in the Irish peace process that was intractable to the parties, be it prisoner release, be it the peace accord itself, be it decommissioning, all had international influence. George Mitchell, Rassi Hasmussen, John de Chastelan. There was always an international arbiter that secured honesty to the process, and at the minute the legacy of how we deal with our past is the last unresolved issue of the peace process, and it's the most potent. There is no gun in Irish politics anymore, but the sectarianism and the acid is still there, and there does need to be an international oversight. Richard Haas, a Washington diplomat, has been assigned to lead talks commencing next week as to how the parties deal with the past. But I have to say, I think it's a disgrace that the British Army, the British state, aren't going to be a party to those talks. They were an actor to the conflict and have resiled themselves from how to deal with the past. It's their past as well, and they're not going to be in the room, so there will be no accountability for the over 300 murders that were committed by the British Army and the thousands of murders which were perpetrated through the British policy of collusion by using loyalist paramilitaries as state proxies. So really it's in flux. What America can do is being done. They've assigned a very senior diplomat, and it remains to be seen. The utility of the Helsinki hearings are exceptional in raising human rights abuses. They have been availed of by the Ballymurphy families, by the McGurk's families, by the Loughlin Island families, those who bereaved at the Ulmer Road bookies killings, and they should be continue to be resourced, cultivated, because the pronouncements from Congressman Chris Smith does have diplomatic weight, and they can ignore the likes of me, they can ignore politicians, but they don't tend to really ignore pronouncements coming out of serious diplomatic institutions such as the Helsinki Committee.
I'm going to just use the prerogative of the very last word, because we do have people massing outside and our time is short. I want to thank our speakers for laying out very vividly some of the challenges, some of the specific cases, and some of the overarching principles that would govern the fight against impunity and the efforts towards accountability and transitional justice in Northern Ireland. I would encourage any of you interested, and I thank you all for coming and staying, to look at this report, which should be downloadable probably now at Amnesty's website. In the end, they say investigating human rights violations and abuses to establish the truth and ensure justice is essential to address impunity in Northern Ireland and to ensure meaningful and lasting peace. Victims must also be provided with full and effective reparation. Steps therefore need to be taken to find a way to systematically and comprehensively address the human rights violations and abuses committed in Northern Ireland's past. Without the political will on all sides to acknowledge and confront past abuses, the lessons of history will go unheeded, and the pain caused by Northern Ireland's past will continue to cast a long shadow over its future. I think on that note, we thank our speakers. We hope that work will continue to be done and we will find solutions and we'll be able to move forward in an era of peace and reconciliation. Thank you all for coming.